Welcome to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we showcase the voices and stories behind America's changing electric grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. Like every part of the United States, the western states are grappling with how to secure reliable and cost-effective power while pursuing emissions reductions and managing changing weather. Last summer, extreme drought and heat put pressure on hydropower and other sources, making the grid increasingly dependent on wind and solar that can't operate 24/7. This summer, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation says the West is among regions that could face electricity shortfalls if temperatures spike. Many are calling to further integrate the Western power grid and expand organized power markets and competition among states, saying it will increase reliability and help bring cleaner, cost-effective electricity to the residents of California, Colorado, and other neighboring states. In the latest development, CalISO, the California grid operator, has proposed developing what it calls the extended day-ahead market, which would allow more participants to buy and sell power on a day-ahead basis, with potential savings of $543 million to $1.2 billion per year, emissions reductions, and reliability benefits. This episode's guest is Scott Miller. Scott is Executive Director of the Western Power Trading Forum. It's an organization of companies involved in providing power to Western states that all advocate for competitive market rules. I asked Scott to join us to share what the outlook is for reliability in the West this summer and what the state of play is for expanding markets. Good morning, Scott, and thanks for joining us. As you know, you are the Executive Director of the Western Power Trading Forum, and for those that maybe are not as familiar as they should be, tell us what the WPTF is and what you're doing.
Sure. Well, WPTF has been around since the late 90s when wholesale and retail competition started in California. Wholesale competition, of course, had been going on in some form on the bilateral scale in the West quite a bit. Initially, it was mostly a band of married participants, mostly IPPs and power marketers who were interested initially in the California ISO, but also what was then anticipated to be RTOs across the West. It's fluxed and grown over the years, depending on what's been going on. Of course, there was the California energy, well, it was a Western energy crisis, quite frankly.
Right.
And interestingly, it grew then. We're now about 115 members, and they include our traditional IPPs and power marketers and retail marketers, but they also include CCAs, public utilities. We've got BPA that's a member, LEDWP, several IOUs. And they transact in all states in the WEC. And I think the main thing that now that the West is so interested in an integrated market, they're interested in the information that we provide. But as always, we're an advocate for competition, and our board members are entirely composed of entities that don't serve rate-based load. So. While we've got a lot of utilities that are members, we're at heart all about competition.
Which is no surprise to regular listeners of this podcast that we are simpatico when it comes to that issue. And as we're recording this episode, we're coming up on Memorial Day, on the official start of the summer season. And last summer, as you know better than most, we saw a lot of headlines about extreme weather, heat and drought, and all the stress that was putting on the Western power system. And as you're prognosticating or looking ahead to this summer, could you elaborate on what both you see coming this summer, and what are some of the unique challenges that the West faces that maybe aren't common in the Eastern RTOs?
Well, let me start with the latter part first, because the West has, as we found out during the energy crisis in 2001, is is not, I wouldn't say hydro dominated, but heavily influenced by hydropower.
Sure.
This is true, of course, with the Bonneville, WAPA.
WAPA is the Western Area Power Administration.
The Pacific Northwest, Columbia River systems, but also California has a tremendous hydro system. And then, of course, there's the lower Colorado system that includes Glen Canyon and Hoover Dam. And so that's kind of what makes the West unique and probably provided the initial pushback back in the early 2000s to rolling into an RTO. But it also has traditionally been, it's a very, because the population centers, they're dominated to be on the coast, yet there are a lot of thermal and plants that were in the interior West. And the transmission system, of course, was much more radial than it has been in very interconnected East. It's kind of interesting that the interest in integrated markets has more to do with the fact that we need to utilize the transmission system that we've got to a greater extent. And that's why people are interested in a network dispatch of an integrated market. But as we look forward to this particular summer, we're in a slightly different situation than we've been in the last couple of summers. We had, as many people may know, fairly robust precipitation from January on. This is particularly the case in California, in the Sierras, a fair amount in the Rockies, particularly in the part of the Rockies that serves the lower Colorado system. Had more of an average year in the Pacific Northwest, and almost a very arid year in what I'll call Western Canada, British Columbia, Alberta. And you always have to think of all these different pieces. When you say hydro in the West, it's not like, oh, God, they got a lot of precipitation in California. Well, that's good. And we've started to see how that's benefiting other people because we had our first heat wave in the West this last weekend. And California Hydro helped offset some of the needs to run thermal plants and was there just as nuclear plants are coming back from refueling. So and so we anticipate that we should be in a better situation than we were last year. Of course, you never know how you get towards the end of the hydro year, the end of August, early September when it's still hot. And if you get a west-wide heat wave like we did in August 2020, and if it's prolonged the way it was in September of last year, we could be in a challenging situation. But for now, things look better than they were before.
Yeah, it's interesting that it is fairly significantly different than many of the Eastern RTOs. I mean, we just don't have that level of hydro participation in the East. For purposes of making sure that people know how we're defining the West, it might make sense for you to explain where your area of responsibility would cover.
Sure. As most people listening to this podcast will know, the United States is divided into, well, at least the lower 48 are divided into three electrical systems, interconnections. It's the East that essentially goes almost from the Rockies over to the Atlantic. The ERCOT, of course, sits by itself, and then our system and what my organization and our members are concerned with is that area, basically just east of Denver, what we call the front face of the Rockies. All the way out to the Pacific Ocean, but also up into British Columbia and Alberta. That is the Western interconnection and a little bit of Tijuana.
Perfect. I think that will help those that maybe aren't as well versed as to what we're talking about. So as we've talked about some of the challenges historically and how you're viewing this coming year, what are some of the common themes or the common issues that are driving some of the reliability concerns in the West?
Well, it depends on your perspective about whether this is a problem or an opportunity. I mean, certainly any transformation you run to sometimes the ragged edge of reliability as you're moving from one resource mix to another. To be honest with you, the renewable integration began probably in the West about the same time it began in ERCOT, but it really began in earnest because the West does not have as formidable a transmission system as ERCOT does. ERCOT, of course, built out their transmission system right before they went to wholesale competition. But there were significant wind initially, penetration, particularly in the Bonneville, Columbia Gorge area, and of course, California, because California has been pushing on the renewable string for a very, very long time.
Yep.
And it began when I was on FERC staff at the time. And we got some renewable owners of renewable resources, wind resources, that came in and were greatly annoyed at being curtailed by Bonneville.
Sure.
And at WAPA, and they came to FERC and sort of said, hey, we want some relief on this. And FERC began looking into the Federal Power Act and realized that through its responsibilities for reliability, it did have some sort of jurisdiction over the grid that concerned Bonneville and WAPA, and began enforcing some new rules as it pertained to curtailment of wind. That, I think, began an interest in what can we do with this production of wind when it's exceeding what our needs are and the needs of the system. And then it began, as people began to rely on that, as we ran down that string, and it began to become more prevalent, and even in places like Washington and Oregon, and Wyoming. There's a lot of wind in Wyoming. And okay, what do we do with this power? And that's when the interest in the energy imbalance market with CAISO began.
Yep.
This Pacific Core, which of course is the largest transmission owner in the West, decided that it wanted to do something with this on a real-time basis. And that's when CAISO and Pacific Core began in 2013, 2014. The energy imbalance market, which was a place to sort of take excess megawatts. And sometimes when you were short megawatts, you could possibly in real time buy. And so that became an opportunity. Then, because of various policy requirements in various states, thermal assets started to be retired. Hydro, whether you want to call it climate change or just bad luck, hydro became less predictable.
Sure.
And suddenly everyone understood that the contract path, or intuitively they began to understand that the contract path method of transacting and using the transmission system, which of course places artificial limitations on use of the transmission system, was not helpful to the situation. And so people began to look for ways to better utilize the transmission system. And I remember I was still on FERC staff, and we thought, oh, great, this is going to lead to a West-wide RTO. We're struggling with that for various reasons that we can get into later. But there is this strong desire to better integrate what had been a very sort of, this is my territory.
Yeah.
And the sort of desire to keep it my territory has to do with another aspect of the West, which is unique. And that is the prevalence of public power, which is generally speaking non-jurisdictional to FERC.
Correct.
You have a huge amount of things like public utility districts in Washington, munis like LADWP, special irrigation and other type units like Salt River Power down in Arizona. Like I said, WAPA and Bonneville. Nearly 50% of the load is not jurisdictional to FERC, nor is it jurisdictional to any state utility commissions.
Right.
And so that was fine until when you could take care of yourself, and suddenly everybody realized that they sort of needed each other.
Right. So it's interesting that you have added another layer of complication, which I think is important as people think about, what is happening in the West. So it feels like there's been some incremental progress moving towards the energy imbalance market. And now there's a lot of conversation around how do we make the next big step to Western RTO. And the states seem to be driving a lot of that, or at least are actively engaged in the conversations around expanding that. So I guess help us understand, kind of the whys, but also how will customers benefit, or how will this also work to improve reliability concerns? I think you touched on it a little bit, but I think, help us understand with that unique structure of the West, the way it's different with the, large portions of the service territory, for lack of a better description, not regulated by FERC or by state PUCs. You're kind of putting a different kind of patchwork together. So kind of walk us through that. It's a little complicated, but I know you're the one that can help us sort it out.
Well, I'll give him a good shot. I think your characterization of the states is mostly accurate, but it depends on the states. I mean, certainly Oregon and Washington, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, these are states, and Utah, quite frankly, have been very, very interested in regional integration. California has recently woken up to the fact that they need to be integrated to the rest of the West. If you'll pardon me a little bit of a side, California has always been a net importer. But if anybody's an old movie buff and they've ever seen Streetcar Named Desire that had Marlon Brando, but Vivian Leigh in this great role where she was Blanche Dubois, the pain in the butt sister-in-law, who one time has a famous line that I think describes California very well. She said, "I've always relied on the kindness of strangers." And California relies on the West an awful lot. And California's happy to serve that because that's where the load is, that's where the money is.
Sure.
You have other states like Wyoming and Montana, and this is driven by a variety of factors, politics, but also attitudes on renewables, where they're less interested in it, but they're also interested in reliability.
Right.
And this is where the two can meet if you articulate it properly. An integrated market, we found in the West, is necessary to meet reliability. First and foremost, that's what people really became interested in because they knew that they needed to move megawatts and they needed to be able to access it. And when they were doing it on the traditional contract path methodology, we all know, let's leave aside the issue of whether or not you get permission from neighboring utilities to get the transmission. The bigger issue is because you're trying to create this artifice of making it contractually look like a natural gas pipeline. You're trying to contract as if you're going in one direction. We all know that electricity goes along the path of least resistance as opposed to gas molecules just going, as they're compressed in a certain direction. To maintain this fiction, you are going to contract, but because electricity naturally affects systems next to them, you would artificially limit the capacity of the transmission system so that it wouldn't overload your neighbor's system. And so as a consequence, you weren't utilizing the transmission system to its maximum effect. And when you're in an area such as the West, which the last 4 years have been probably the most resource constrained region in the country, you really need that transmission system to move what generation you've got. And so this is the nexus point where people are interested in markets for integrating renewables, but people are also interested who don't give a hoot about renewables are interested in the market integration and full use of the transmission system for reliability purposes. And this has been, so you must make sure that you have this common lingua franca when you're discussing this. But in the West, because there is some suspicion of things like centralized capacity markets.
Yes.
And we've all watched from the West the sort of capacity market fatigue that's going on in the East, which is having an effect on regulators. And we need the regulators, so let's not annoy them unnecessarily. And quite frankly, we are fine with having a bilateral capacity market, which we call resource adequacy. There is also a suspicion, and this has occurred in regions across the country, about interconnection procedures done regionally. I think the one thing that I would like for us to adopt that they've got in the East in the RTO structure is transmission planning. But of course, in the West, they're planning on doing it through another organization, a couple of organizations, Order 1000 organizations. And so what we're left with right now is market integration, and this is an incremental step where we're going to build on the energy imbalance market, which is a real-time market, and then try to layer on a day-ahead market structure, which should replicate a network dispatch similar to an RTO, while still each utility still has its oats in place. So that has been a huge lift, and I will say that at first I was very skeptical about the ability to do this sort of thing. I'm becoming more and more of a fan of pushing in this direction because I think it's the way that we can get everybody to agree to get to market integration to lead to a network dispatch while still allowing each area to try to tinker on things like interconnection issues and transmission planning. And we're doing resource adequacy in a completely different manner than the Eastern RTOs are.
Yeah, it sounds like I either need to extend you my condolences or my sympathies because you're dealing with a different set of issues, but really trying to address many of the same fundamental concepts. I mean, in the end, transmission isn't free. And if you can maximize existing resources and think carefully about how you're going to utilize what may need to be constructed, those are all important issues that are facing the East, but really are facing the West as well, perhaps with a different flavor. So you kind of raised it a couple of times, so I'll just ask you directly. How do you reconcile this affirmative move towards the RTO or towards a market with the challenges that we're facing in the Eastern RTOs?
Well, I think what it's done is the one benefit the West has over the East is that it has been thinking about resource adequacy more in terms of what each individual market player needs, rather than relying on a centralized capacity market, which like I said, I was at PJM when Andy came up with the RPM.
The RPM is short for Reliability Pricing Model, another name for PJM's capacity market, which works to procure reliable power years in advance.
Which theoretically is a beautiful model. The difficulty is that when you run into different states' policies, it becomes a little bit problematic to try to come up with a centralized market structure that satisfies everybody. And the big issue with capacity has always been, in my estimation, for now having done this 25 years, is we all know we need it. And we all may even know that, generally speaking, what the level of capacity we need is. It's always pricing it is the big issue. And so if you do it if you agree on what the levels that everybody needs to have and that people have to sort of come to the market and show their capacity, which is the first step in what is now the Western Resource Adequacy Program. It's the first time the West has ever dealt with resource adequacy on a regional basis. Then you can settle it on a bilateral basis, and therefore the price becomes something between counterparties rather than through, let's face it, the administrative construct of a centralized capacity market. Now, I know that there are differences of opinion on that. That just happens to be my viewpoint.
Sure. And that's consistent with what they've been doing historically. So it's probably a level of comfort that can be more readily achieved than starting from a whole different perspective. So what would you say the state of play is, and what would you say the remaining hurdles are to get from where the West is to having that Western wide or an RTO that encompasses large parts of the West?
Well, I want to try to not be overly optimistic because as somebody who's been pushing on markets for 25 years, I felt the need to be an optimist. Otherwise, I never would have survived. The direction certainly is in one of market integration in a uniquely Western way that may ultimately get to. I would like for us to get to one or more RTOs that, where there's an RTO filing at FERC, which means a single tariff. What we do think we're going to get is two market structures in a day-ahead, real-time market structure that will be based on an SPP offering called Markets Plus, and CAISO's offering, which is an outgrowth of the energy imbalance market called the extended day-ahead market. The issue, I think, will come down to there's tremendous momentum behind the SPP Markets Plus approach. Right now, CAISO's EDAM looks like it's CAISO and Pacificor, and people are waiting for CAISO to file a tariff for this day-ahead market, which is coming up pretty quickly. And SPP Markets Plus is aiming to file its tariff for its day-ahead market the end of this calendar year, and be in operation in 25. CAISO in operation in late 24, maybe 25. So the reality is, I think that we'll get there. The boundaries of where they're going to be will be determined to some extent, I think, by is the California legislature going to allow CAISO to change the governance such that it has an independent governance structure that other utilities will feel comfortable joining that group. CAISO is a very good market administrator, good grid operator, just as SPP is. It's not a matter of the management; it's a matter of the political influence that can be exerted. And I must emphasize, there is a difference between CAISO and California politics. Sure. CAISO tries very, very hard to play it honest. They do, however, have a governance structure that sort of pushes on them a little bit. If CAISO can get the independence right, I can see a large portion of the area around California being in the EDAM, and then the rest of the West being in SPP Markets Plus, Bonneville probably being in SPP Markets Plus. Be interesting to see where Arizona goes, Arizona and New Mexico. Colorado will be in the SPP Markets Plus thing. And then, of course, it'll be up to both the market administrators and FERC to enforce some kind of joint operating agreement so that you can actually still transact across. Right. The big challenge will be, are we able to, California's unique resource adequacy structure, can it function with the wider West resource adequacy structure? But we're getting there, absent some sort of horrific experience like we experienced in 2000, 2001, or something like, I don't know. There have been a couple of things in the East, like, Green Hat and stuff like that. I think we're going to get there in fairly short order. Whether we get to a full RTO, I don't know.
Right. I'm shocked to hear you say there's politics involved in the power industry. That's news. Yes. That's a stunner. So
yes, but Captain Renault, here are your winnings.
So you brought up the Western energy crisis of the early 2000s, and you have some deep experience there. So I think the history around that is generally well known. But I'm also curious how someone who has your perspective and was so intimately involved in the investigations that went into that both thinks about it. And then what lessons should we have learned, and did we learn them? And are there things that carry forward into the situation we find ourselves either in the West or more nationally today from the outcome of that event?
Unfortunately, I walked in for my job on IPP, US Gen, which is PG&E National Energy Group, into FERC in July of 2000, and I was in charge of energy markets, and the predecessor to OMLA.
Okay.
And they said, here are 45 people you've never met. Can you get an investigation done in 45 days? And I thought the staff put together, I'll say the staff because I just helped oversee it with Andre Wolfman from OGC. I thought they did a very good job in creating a historical analysis of what had transpired, what the problems was. The problem is everybody has their own narrative.
Sure.
And when you go out West, in particular California, it was evil market doers. Well, the reality was it was a little more complicated. It was a bad market design that relied on the spot market. California, for political reasons, made it very, very difficult to transact in terms of long-term contracts. There was there was a bad hydro year that year. The economy was running super hot. It was, the end of the .com era. And as a consequence, because CAISO was a net importer, the rules for CAISO only applied to generators that were in CAISO. So it created an incentive for what people would call market manipulation. California decided to deal with scarcity by lowering price caps. And of course, the problem was there wasn't enough power.
Right.
So they kept lowering the price cap. The problem was the price cap only affected power that was in California. So it provided an incentive for somebody to take power outside California and bring it in underneath, that didn't, where the price cap didn't apply. The reality is, and I understand why people perceive that as a market manipulation. The reality is, if the ability to sell power at what was more prevailing market rate hadn't occurred, there may have been more blackouts than there were. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who transacted that way was behaving properly, and there were, as we found out, some very bad market participants. But it led to a 20-year litigation and a suspicion in markets in the rest of the West that persisted for a considerable period of time, such that when the FERC tried to do standard market design, it was absolutely fought hard in the West. As we saw, it was fought in the Southeast, of course, too, with its very powerful congressional delegation. But it created a narrative that was essentially anti-market for a considerable period of time. And we still hear echoes of it. I would say that one of the problems was we were naive in those days. We thought that electricity was a commodity. We were trying to commoditize it. The reality is it may be from a strictly economic standpoint, but nobody perceives it as a commodity.
Sure.
We have to recognize it's not deregulated. It's not treated the way natural gas or oil is. That there are certain public perceptions on this, and that we always have to sort of do what's necessary to try to either keep the policymakers involved, but recognize that there sometimes may be compromises in our market ideals that will have to be done. I'll give you one example. Back in the day, I looked at the situation and I was non-decisional, which meant that I could talk to anybody. And I talked to damn near everybody, from governor's office in California on down. And it came to me early on that there was a deal to be made, that the people who own generation needed to find some sort of deal. And you needed to find the politician who could cut the deal. In those early days, you might have been able to, but you got to move early. We could have reached out to the AG in California. The better person may have been somebody like Dianne Feinstein or somebody like that to cut a deal, because the politics were rapidly moving in the governor's office towards, let's find a boogeyman and let's blame it on FERC and the evil out-of-state generators. And so just beware of the politics as soon as possible.
Yeah. There are some great lessons that linger, I think, with that. So with that kind of as background, are there any energy issues that you're watching in the West, not necessarily specifically related to that, but more broadly, that are issues that you're paying attention to?
Yeah, I'm wondering how, as somebody who I believe that climate change is real, and I believe that there's a need to make the transition to cleaner uses of the grid. But I like many people, I worry about where the ragged edge occurs and whether or not we can make it work in time. The politics of the coastal West versus the interior West is always a concern, particularly as we go through this market integration. We've got to be very, very careful about that. You can't appear to be overly one way or the other.
Yeah.
The middle is and compromise is something that is not necessarily in highly valued in our political debate. But I think that as we deal with politics with electricity, I think an appreciation for the middle ground and compromise is something that we need to be very aware of.
Yep.
But an energy transition will happen. But I do worry that we're getting to the point where we're going to have near zero marginal cost units dominating, particularly the daily dispatch. That's fine. That's understandable. The question then becomes, what do you do and how do you compensate the dispatchable resources that you need? Now, I do hope, and one of our members, UAMPS, is very, very close to getting a PPA for a small modular reactor in Idaho. Things like dispatchable units that are zero carbon like that, I think, are things that hopefully we'll begin to deploy in greater numbers. But for the foreseeable future, we're going to need things like natural gas.
Yep.
But how do we compensate for them? And Jan Smutney Jones, my colleague in California, has often referred to California as the canary in the coal mine. Now it's beginning to look like ERCOT in California. Interesting, the politics of those two states. They're in the same place, though.
Yeah.
So we're going to need the natural gas, but are these things going to be around? Because they're not necessarily going to be compensating the energy market. I don't know in resource adequacy if it's structured in such a way, because we need to get to a place, I think, where resource adequacy and capacity has always been about megawatts, regardless of where they are. Now, you may differentiate them based on an ELCC, effective load carrying capability. But we're going to have natural gas plants sitting around that aren't run very often, and that's good news from an environmental standpoint, but you want them to be around. Is there some sort of differentiating market structure, or not a market structure, a compensation structure necessary for that? I don't know. It's a difficult conversation to have, but it's probably one that we need to have.
And that sounds wildly consistent with some of the conversations in the East as well. So lastly, let me just ask you, what are some of the current or emerging technologies that you see that hold some promise for meeting future energy needs, maybe are deployable in the West? You mentioned some small modular reactors perhaps being piloted in the West, but are there any things that are happening in the West or more broadly that you're really excited about?
I am excited about small modular reactors, of course. I'm also increasingly interested, and I don't know to what degree I would call myself optimistic, but interested in how renewable hydrogen production could be used to repurpose our natural gas fleet. It was funny. I was at a Clean Energy Buyers Association meeting in Seattle last week, and somebody mentioned, he goes, "Oh, how about pumped hydro?" And I was like, "Yeah, if you find the land and you're able to permit it, good luck." I remain hopeful that legislation on permitting will alleviate some of the roadblocks, because permitting transmission is always going to be a pain, and it's particularly difficult in the West because there's so much federal land, and that falls under the Bureau of Land Management, tribal issues, and things like that. But I think one of the things that's unique in the West that I'm kind of optimistic about is there's this sort of customer-based approach to transmission builds. We're about to build a bunch of transmission in the sort of Wyoming area to move wind down into California, which has been going on. They've been working on that for 15 years, and West Connect. And PacifiCorp looks like it's fairly close on its Gateway project. But then there's the SunZia project that's going to move a lot of solar out of New Mexico through Arizona and into California. The transmission system is something that definitely needs to be expanded in the West, whether or not we fully utilize it the way that we hope to. Because of the sparseness of the population, we've needed to expand it.
Sure.
But that's a unique way that the West has been doing it. It's sort of a subscriber-based approach to transmission that in some ways kind of looks like big, interstate gas transmission lines. And it's putting pieces together. And in some ways, it's going to realize outcomes that may be faster than they've done in the East. But that doesn't mean that we don't need some permitting reform and legislation.
Sure. We certainly share that position, because without it, I don't know how anything is going to get done. And I
Right.
don't know if we ensure reliability with some of the challenges that are
Right.
on the horizon. So, Scott, you've been very generous with your time this morning. Thank you very much for visiting with us and for participating. It's always nice to have a different discussion than some of the same things we talk about in the East. So it's good to hear that progress is being made in the West and that challenges exist, but parties are interested in trying to solve the problems, because I think in the end, that's what we're all trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I think we're moving in a good direction, and it's one where everyone's trying to be cognizant of everyone else's equity issues, but at the moment it feels like good cooperative progress in the West.
Great. Well, thank you, Scott. We appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you.
EPSA supports efforts to expand competitive markets and integration in the West. Other areas of the United States have seen significant benefits from RTOs and ISOs. Western states should have access to the cost savings, reliability, and innovation that organized regional energy markets provide. You can learn more about the WPTF and Western power issues at WPTF.org. And we're always covering the state of electric reliability and solutions on our website at EPSA.org. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. If you like this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on Twitter at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating, or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.